Voni and Alex Demore. They're going to be presenting POINTWISE, predicting points and value decisions in real time with NBA optical tracking data. This will be a 20-minute presentation, and at the end we'll line up for 5 minutes of Q&A. So thank you, and welcome Dan and Alex.
Thanks, Jeff. Okay. So we also want to give a shout out to our two other co-authors, Luke Bourne, who can't be here, and Kurt Goldsberry sitting right there. You've probably all seen this before. It's a picture of an EKG used to monitor patients' heart rates who are checked into the hospital. You've seen pictures like this before. It's a bunch of stock prices used to give sort of a real-time estimate of the value of a company, or alternatively, the value of your portfolio. And if you watch the presidential debates on CNN, we even saw this down here, which is sort of this mood chart that they ran. What they did was they literally had a focus group of people watching the debate, pushing knobs based on how they felt about what the candidates were saying. So when people talked about creating jobs, these things went up, and they nosedived when people said things like binders full of women. So what do all these graphics have in common? They all show real-time modeling of things that we care about. So can we create a stock ticker for basketball? And we want to create something that's not just predicting the outcome of a game, but the outcomes of actual possessions. Now, in an NBA possession, players make decisions in fractions of a second that dramatically decrease and increase the value of possession. That just gets lost when we look at box score summaries. Now, if you don't believe me, let's watch this possession from a Spurs game about a year ago. Now, imagine you're a Spurs fan and part of some focus group where you're pushing mood knobs based on how you feel about the Spurs' chances for this possession. Just to give you some context, there's about 9 seconds left in this game. Spurs are down by 2, so this is probably their last chance to score and win or extend the game. Yeah, that's where you're supposed to be clapping. You're part of the Spurs focus group, not us. So what does your mood ticker look like for that possession? What does it look like when Parker starts it off by getting the ball? What does it look like when he penetrates towards the basket and eventually dishes out to Leonard in the corner 3? When Leonard shoots, how confident are you that that shot is going to go in? Now, these things are hard to quantify. But even if you do have some idea of how much value these things are worth, let me ask you this. How many of you can tell me all 5 players the Spurs have on the court right now? Without looking, just by remembering the video. And if you can't, I would ask you why I should trust your value prediction. It'd be like taking advice from a portfolio manager who tells you the value of the portfolio without knowing what stocks are in it. So our project, Expected Possession Value, or EPV for short, creates the stock ticker for an NBA possession. And this is what that possession that we just watched looks like from our stock ticker graph. It starts out with an expected possession value of about 0.86 when Parker gets the ball to kick it off. When he drives towards the basket, the EPV goes up to 1.36, which is already well above the baseline of an NBA possession, which is around 1. Passing it to Leonard out in the corner drives the EPV all the way up to 1.75. So at this point, we're almost a full point, expected point, higher value in this possession than we were when it started off. Even though no shots have happened yet, no points have actually been scored. The EPV drops a little bit to 1.58 by the time the actual shot goes off because Dion Waiters attempts to contest. But it's still a very valuable shot. And of course, as you saw, it goes in and the Spurs won the game. Now, if we have a conventional box score summary of this game, all we see is a couple of integers. Leonard made the game-winning shot. Parker got the assist. We don't see, for instance, that the value Parker created by driving to the basket. And perhaps the most important thing to take away is that if Leonard had missed that shot, then what credit does Parker get by having set up the play in our conventional box score summaries? Nothing.
All right, so what exactly is it that we're charting on that little stock ticker graph over there? Well, this is something that we call EPV, or expected possession value. And in words, it's the number of points that the offense is expected to score by the end of the possession, given everything that we know right now. And we think this definition has a few really big ideas that we want to highlight here, right? The first is that we're measuring this in terms of points, which we really think is the ultimate currency in the NBA. That's what we want to measure everything in terms of. We're also looking at expected points, so we're trying to average out luck by thinking about what would happen if we ran this play over 100 times. Would that lucky 2 still fall? We're also looking at all the information that we have right now. We're using some SportView optical tracking data here, so we're using a snapshot of the entire ecosystem of the court, all 10 players, where the ball is, to try to get a sense of how this possession is going to end. And finally, we want this to be instantaneous. We want to be able to look at what the expected possession value is now and how it changes when we see more and more of the possession unfold. So how do you go about calculating something like that? If you think about the standard statistical tools, something like regression isn't going to work because you don't have these nice input-output pairs that you usually have in that context. If you think about something like Markov chains that are being used now in baseball, you can't use a similar technique like that because basketball isn't discrete. It has all these continuous states. You can't just say that there are 28 or 24 different ways that the possession can be configured. So the way that we think about this is to think about EPV as a path average. That is, to look at where we are in the possession right now and think about all the paths that the possession could take before it ends. So here, for example, if we start thinking about that play that we just watched on video, it starts out with Parker accepting a screen from Tim Duncan. One of the ways that this possession could go is Parker could dump the ball off to Duncan, who could then take a jump shot. But Parker could also take the ball himself and drive towards the rim. And in that case, there's another sort of branch on this path. Parker can take the ball and try to finish with a layup himself. Or, like we saw in the video, he can kick it out to Kawhi Leonard, who can then take a three-point shot. Now, of course, these aren't the only paths that this possession could have taken. There are, in fact, an uncountable number of paths that it could have taken. But we're just going to highlight these 3. In any case, what we really care about is how the possession ends, right? These sort of actions that are occurring in the gray box there. And what we want to do is to average together the value of each of those actions at the very end of the possession. So how do we do that? Well, we start thinking about how those endpoints are more or less likely than others. And that starts from the decisions that are being made right now. Right? So when Tony Parker actually accepts the screen from Duncan, we look at his tendencies in this particular spatial situation and reweight each of these paths by his tendency to make a decision. Right? So here, for example, we think that he's more likely to drive to the hoop than he is to dump the ball off to Duncan. And then we can also look at all the other downstream decisions that Parker makes, reweight those different events, and then finally we end up with a final weighting of all the outcomes of the possession. We can add those together, and that gives you expected possession value. Now you can also think about how this changes as we see more and more of the possession unfold. For example, when we see that Parker is not going to take the option to give Duncan the ball, we can start from the point where he actually decides to drive to the hoop. And in that case, we can just do a reweighting based on what we know could possibly happen, and then just look at the sum of the relevant outcomes that are left over. All right, so how do we do that? How do we actually compute these sort of path probabilities? Well, we think that computing EPV really comes down to answering the question, what happens next? Right? So given the data that we have right now, we can actually see where all the players are on the court. And sorry, I should say that this is a different possession. This is a Spurs versus Oklahoma City possession here, where we can now see that Leonard has the ball at the top of the arc. And what we want to do is see what the next likely decision is. So based on this raw data here, we start layering on different levels of analysis based on what we've seen from the whole season from the Spurs. Well, the first level of analysis is relatively simple. What we look at is how players tend to move on the court when they don't necessarily do a sort of big move like passing the ball. So we call this the dynamics or micro-transitions layer. And what this shows you is just where a player is likely to be 1/25th of a second in the future if they're just sort of moving around based on their position, velocity, acceleration. After that, we put on an action layer, and this is where all the magic is, really. This is where we look at what basketball moves are likely to occur based on the spatial situation here. And when we say a basketball move, we mean something like passing the ball to a teammate or taking a shot. In the future, we can also add things like making a drive to the basket. Now, based on our analysis of these players' tendencies, we say here, for example, that Kawhi Leonard has a 29% probability of taking this shot himself. he also has a 29% probability of passing the ball to Danny Green, who's standing in the corner there. When we combine these two ways of looking at the possession, whether somebody is going to move the ball themselves or whether they're going to take a basketball move and actually make a pass or take a shot, we can start getting a sense of what the value of each of these states of the possession are. And so using that, we can actually add on a value layer. And this tells us what the value of each of these endpoints is to these big basketball moves that Kawhi Leonard could make. So for example, if Kawhi Leonard were to pull up and take the shot right now, that would be worth about 0.7 points. And that's not very much. But if he were to pass the ball to Danny Green right now, that would be worth about 1.1 points. And when you average those together, those are sort of the two biggest options that he has right now. When you average those together, that gives you that the current expected possession value is about 0.9 points right now. And these are the sorts of ways that we can break down a possession once we start looking at it through the lens of expected possession value.
Okay, because this is a short talk, we're not going to go into too much detail about how the math behind this actually works, but we're just going to take a quick peek. So the three layers Alex mentioned correspond to three different statistical models. For the microtransitions, the macrotransitions or action layer, and also the value layer. So we're going to focus mostly on the macrotransitions because these are sort of the heart of our model. The statistical model we use for this is called competing risks, which was originally developed in the medical literature for predicting when and why people die. Because that's pretty morbid, it's nice to have an example where we're predicting something more optimistic, which is the kinds of decisions, ball movements, that players make when they have the ball. So what we do with our macro transition model, the reason why it's the heart of our model is because in any given point in time, a player has to either pass, shoot, or turn the ball over in order for the possession to end. So we know that our main problem is just to figure out what the next big ball action is going to be. And then once we know that, we can sort of try and figure out what that ball action is, when it's going to happen, and then pass it down through the rest of our model to get the value of that play. So let's look at how this macro transition model, this competing risk model actually works. In order to estimate LeBron's tendency to do things like pass or take shots in any spatial situation, we sort of need to see into his mind and understand his decision process. Now, we assume that there are two basic components in his decision to, for example, take a shot from this particular location. There's a spatial effect, which takes where he is on that court, and it maps it onto a surface, which represents, just given that location, how likely is he to attempt a shot in a small time window. Next thing we do is modulate these estimates of his tendency to take shots by situational attributes, like whether he's being guarded by a defender close by or whether he's taken a dribble so far this possession. And lastly, all the relationships that we've illustrated here, we assume might play out differently for different players and different shot types, or different event types, passes versus shots, things like that. Well, that model looks really cool. It's pretty hard to estimate because, for one thing, space is sparse. Now, how do we predict the decisions that players will make in places where they've never been before or only barely been before? Now, just to make sure you're still paying attention, let me ask you this. What's Dwight Howard's shooting percentage from the corner three? Anybody know? It's not undefined. He's the best corner three shooter in the NBA. You might be, like Ray Allen, be skeptical of that, but if you look at his shot chart, look at this, he's 2 for 2. Okay? Now, if he takes that shot 100 times, how many times does he make it? 2. We think about 30, okay? And here's how we think 30. We assume that his performance on the court is similar to players who occupy the same roles on their team. So we kind of create this network for him. So we assume his performance is similar to that of these guys. Furthermore, we assume his performance from that corner three is similar to his performance from other locations on the court that maybe require the same shooting attributes. So these aren't assumptions that we've put on there. Our model, we've actually designed a model such that these assumptions get picked up automatically. Once we combine these things, we take his original shot chart and we shrink it towards something like this, which looks kind of the same around the basket, where he's taken a lot of shots and we have a lot of information. And where we don't have a lot of information, we've borrowed it from these other sources to create a smoother picture of his abilities. Lastly, because our model is pretty complicated and the scale of the data is huge, so we're actually using every frame of SportView data here. We're not sort of throwing away a bunch of it to only look at specific events. It's important to make sure our model outputs are actually reasonable. And because the data is private, we don't really have a lot of stuff out there to test it against. So we have, because we have several people working on this project, we do a lot of things redundantly so that we can make sure we get the same results among ourselves. The other important thing we do is holdout testing, where we fit the model to a small portion of the data and then test predictions on the remaining portion of the data and see how well our predictions match the truth. And there may be several models that seem reasonably consistent with the truth, but we can actually pick the best model by looking not just do they predict the truth correctly, but how well they predict it. And so that's what we've done to select the models that we use in our project. Most importantly, our coding is such that at any given time we can generate the model output given the data that we have for a particular possession. And so we can all plot this in these quick animations, which just tell us the most important thing, which is whether our model passes the eye test.
All right, so Dan talked about how EPV really adds something to the richness of recording an NBA game, because right now, the numbers that we tend to record show up in the box score. They're just from the end of the possession. What we're suggesting is that EPV can actually give you a number for every moment of the possession to evaluate how well the team is doing. And we think that this can serve as a raw material for really a slew of new NBA metrics. We're just going to give you two examples here. We think that actually people with better basketball minds will probably come up with better metrics from EPV. So the most natural question to ask here, right? EPV is sort of defined around decision making are who are the best decision makers? And this is something that we tried to capture in a statistic that we call EPV Added. Now this answers the question, given a player's particular basketball predicaments, the particular spatial situations he finds himself in, how well does he make decisions? And we measure this in terms of the expected points per game he adds to his team versus the league average player in those same predicaments, if you put the league average player in his shoes. So this is our top 10 list for the first half of the season here. You might notice that Jose Calderon is up there at the top. Now, Jose Calderon is a low-usage point guard who manages to make very good use of his particular spatial situations, largely because of his unusually good shooting ability. But you'll also see some very big names up there, like LeBron James, Dirk Nowitzki, and Kevin Durant a little bit further down. And these are players who tend to see more general spatial situations on the court. And the fact that they actually show up on this list is pretty remarkable, because it means that in all those spatial situations they find themselves in, they are outperforming the league average. On the other side of the coin, you see a lot of players who are asked to do a little bit more than they probably should be doing for their team, or who end up taking a little bit more responsibility in their team than they should. And so the spatial predicaments that they find themselves in, they're not using them quite as efficiently as they could. Another question that you can ask here is about selfish shooters, right? Now, the conventional wisdom about selfish shooters is that it's somebody who takes a shot when there was probably a better pass or other option for his team that was available, right? So he's padding his own stats at the cost of his team's win probability. So the EPV model provides you this very natural way of seeing whether somebody is a selfish shooter, right? At the moment of a decision, we actually see what the expected value of each of those decision options are. And so we can ask, at the moment of the shot, was this shot really the best option? And many of you probably won't be surprised to see who's at the top of this list, given the last one. It's again Jose Calderon. And this is because if you're a very good shooter, then you need an absolutely excellent pass to pass up your own shot. On the other side here, we actually see something very interesting about the NBA, which is that the most selfish shooters by this metric are actually sort of a net zero for their team. And this is actually sort of good news for what we think about how rational basketball players are. Now, of course, there are a slew of other EPV metrics that we could start looking at. We can do more specific situational metrics. We can start thinking about how off-ball actions actually affect EPV. We can start looking at defense, about whether teams can lower EPV. And one of the most interesting ones is to start looking for those turning points in possessions, like that spike in EPV when Tony Parker passed to Kawhi Leonard, and to see whether those look like the most interesting plays in an entire season. Now, there are a number of limitations to how we've done this analysis here, right? For one, any sort of analysis that's based on player tracking is going to treat players as XY points. And that's just not the case. This block here looked much less interesting on those little cartoons we spat out than it did in real life. But based on the approach that we're taking right now, we think that there are a number of ways that we should extend our work. For one thing, there are a lot of details that we've left out in this particular iteration, right? We don't have the shot clock, we don't have fouls. But because we're using this very flexible probabilistic model, that's just what these things are. They're details. They're things that we can add in as we go along. But we think that the moral of the story here really is that when you're dealing with big data, and there's been a big discussion about big data revolutionizing basketball analytics, that it's not really the data that's the story, right? Even when you approach these problems, the real big issue that you should be thinking about are bigger questions, questions that people actually care about in the end, and finding models that are necessary to answer those questions that people really care about. And to that end, we've got a great working group going on at Harvard right now. We just want to give a shout out to the two other starters on the team, Alex Franks and Andy Miller, who are doing some great work on defense right now. Thank you all very much for listening.
We've got time for a few questions if anybody wants to come up for Q&A.
Gotta go over there. Just gotta go over there.
Hey, if you guys had the same data for what's like with spatial analysis for the NFL, do you think you could do a similar type of thing with quarterback decision making, whether it is who they're passing to or if it's a read option, who they're handing it off to, and which?
So we were talking about this yesterday, actually, with someone, and the real challenge is that I think what a lot of people want to know is a quarterback making smart throws? And that just depends on so much information that's really hard to see in X, Y. For instance, is the cornerback, does he have his ball, does he have his back to the cornerback? What shoulder is he targeting? I mean, how tall is the cornerback and where are his hands? Mm-hmm. So it's really tough to do, but it'd be fascinating, and I wouldn't rule it out.
Absolutely.
Have you thought about any way to assign or divvy up credit between different players for those spikes in EPV, like when Parker goes around the screen, how much of that is Duncan's screen, how much of that is Parker, how much of that is Greg Popovich?
Yeah, that's actually sort of difficult. In one sense, right, we only see what the players do on the court, so we don't know what Greg Popovich actually drew on his little whiteboard during the timeout before, right? Now, there are certain ways that we can try thinking about divvying up possessions. And I think one aspect is to start looking at basketball less in terms of the actual sort of coordinates that are moving around on the plane and more in terms of how coaches see basketball, right? In terms of these different motifs or idioms that players are running through, like the pick and roll, for example. And if we can see a basketball game broken down into those pieces there, then I think it becomes much easier to try to share that credit between the different people who participated in whatever larger action actually turned into those points.
I think one thing that's cool, picking back on that, is you can actually take the model we have and tweak it if you're a coach. So when we say there's like a 29% chance Leonard passes to Green, that's just based on their historical tendencies. If Pop tells them if you see Green doing this, you should pass to him. And then if you kind of supply your own probabilities, you can still use the exact framework we have to come up with new expected possession values. And I actually think that that's a way that coaches can draw up plays.
Yeah.
When you talked about the situational assessment for each frame, how did you take into account perhaps the mismatch in speed or size between the defender and the person with the ball? In other words, if I have a mismatch in size, I might make a different decision than if Shane Battier is guarding me.
If you have a mismatch in size, you might make a different decision. So the way that we actually computed that situational metric was to simply, we were assuming that we were actually putting a player who is not really responding to that particular spatial situation into the given player's shoes, right? And so one thing that metric is measuring is whether the player in question, the one who we're actually trying to evaluate, is really picking up on all the spatial cues that he's seeing, because we're comparing him to this sort of automaton whose decisions were sort of decided on average across a bunch of other sort of spatial situations. So to answer your question, that particular metric doesn't take that into account. But I think that, right, in general, in this EPV framework, thinking about the responses that you're going to get from the other side is something that's sort of uncharted. Right now it's sort of descriptive, but I think that that's sort of the next step, right? If you think about this in a game theoretic context, EPV sort of gives you the payoffs, and now you can start thinking about doing something like optimizing your best response to what the opponent is doing.
I actually think you just answered a lot of what I was about to ask. I was going to ask For have you looked at the outcome measures essentially for if for the best and worst decision makers or most selfish and unselfish shot makers? We saw the effect of what it does with your model, but have you looked at what it does for the team's scoring margins or plus minuses or anything like that?
We haven't tried to like relate it to current metrics that are out there. I think there's one way of viewing plus minus is just like a really coarsened version of this, where rather than like supplying any spatial information, you're just giving it who's on the court. And that's kind of like similar to what we're doing here. But the difference, of course, is like the numbers we show up there, like the maximum is around like +3 or something. Plus minus range is a lot more because A, it takes into account defense, and B, we actually like remove foul events from our analysis. It turns out that's just something to do with the data because they're kind of a little bit hard to deal with. But those are things that kind of like depress the upper end of our values because players can't get credit in those situations where they can in like a plus minus thing.
We have time for one more.
Hey, thank you. Great paper, guys. I actually had a question. I was looking through the paper, and one of the things that kind of stood out to me was you went to a standard role-independent player. So basically, you're comparing something like somebody like Chris Paul is getting compared to an average player, like the point guard's getting compared to the entire population. Same thing with the centers. So it kind of does seem to skew it more towards point guards. Was that something was that a choice related to complexity and maybe calculation complexity? Is that something you want to pursue in the future?
It's absolutely something we want to pursue in the future. We've actually been talking for just the last few days about sort of what sorts of biases are built into this particular iteration of the metrics that we're looking at. And yeah, we think that really, right, the only fair comparisons to make are people who sort of occupy the same court space, who tend to have similar usage rates. And these are certainly, we think that there are sort of more fruitful breakdowns that we can do of these sorts of metrics, and maybe even customize them to reflect the responsibilities that particular types of players seem to have.
One really cool thing, let me just throw this out there because we're out of time, that we can customize is you saw like on the league average player, Calderon is like plus 3.6, LeBron was below that. We can actually ask the question, what is LeBron's EPV added over Calderon? So if he gets the same spatial situations as Calderon gets, how many more points when we expect to score? And LeBron's actually plus 0.74, meaning that even though Calderon looked better than the league average player in his decision making, part of that is just because when he was making these decisions, he was in very favorable situations. Like most of his shots are when he's uncontested from the wing three, where he shoots like 50%.
Mm-hmm. Because I think one of the things that was running to my mind as I was reading your paper is there's some body of work around what the specific roles that actually exist on a basketball court. And I think with the kind of data that you have, you can kind of start thinking about, well, here's a guy who's basically acting in the ball handler role. Here's a guy who's doing the cut to the hole. Here's a post player, and you can kind of identify that and then start comparing not against the position assignment, but against the actual role, right? And LeBron's an interesting player because LeBron's a guy who can move to different roles depending on the situation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that part of that graph that we showed you for sort of regularizing our estimates for different players, I think is also getting at that similar idea, right? Where we were defining similar players based on the court space that they occupy over the course of the game. So yeah, we think that that's a really important sort of line of research to pursue in the future, and yeah, we'd love to do it.
All right, can you guys join me in thanking Alex and Dan?